to nowhere. Come on inside. Taking that ride to nowhere. We'll take that ride. I'm feeling okay this morning. And you know, we're on the road to paradise. Here we go, here we go. There's a city in my mind. Come along and take that ride, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. And it's very far away, but it's growing day by day, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. Would you like to come along, and you can help me sing this song, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. There's a city in my mind. Come along and take that ride, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. And it's very far away, but it's growing day by day. It's alright, baby, it's alright. They could tell you what to do, but they'll make a fool of you, and it's alright, baby, it's alright.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. So tonight I have a gentleman, well, I'm being presumptuous, he's a gentleman. I haven't quite met him yet. Dun, dun, dun. But he is actually a really great writer about anti-imperialism, primarily about Colombia. And I kind of came across him and asked him to join me. I do a lot of activism and unions and things. And I like to also touch on, these important issues as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Oliver. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. I must say, I love the intro before going into it. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to try and read my writing. You are a co-founder of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice. I was looking at your website and it looks amazing. It looks so informative. Can you just kind of share basically a synopsis about what that is?
Yeah, that's great. So the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, it's an independent research center, 3 co-directors. I'm one of those co-directors. Essentially, we promote online education that's orientated to, critically orientated education. For example, speaking about Colombia, we've got a talk by a former guerrilla fighter, Tanya Nemeyer, coming up on the 7th of November, alongside 8 other talks by, covering various discussions. Vijay Prashad is also going to be giving a talk. So it's an online research center that anyone can sign up to in terms of the events. They're free and available for all. It's really trying to counter the narrative of imperialism and engage in an educational ideological struggle against it. And I think it's more important than ever to do that. I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, I mean, propaganda is one of our biggest problems in the U.S. How does it differ, or does it differ in UK and Colombia? Because I know when I've interviewed people from the UK before, they say, a lot of us, we used to get our news from BBC because they were more impartial than our channels. And now I've heard that they've kind of gone to shit as well. So how do you feel the propaganda is where you are?
Yeah, well, so my research is on Colombia. I'm a doctoral candidate in a university in England. But I'm currently in Colombia, doing an international exchange at one of the universities here, and just generally the academic freedom, the level of academic freedom, the level of freedom of speech in the universities in terms of who you can invite, who you can invite to campus and what you can do on campus. It's so much more open It's ironic that really Britain is considered, falsely, of course, as a leader in the free world and all the rest of that rubbish. But yeah, it's a very closed society, if you ask me, especially in terms of universities. It's great to be in Colombia at the moment in terms of in the university campus. Of course, outside, it's not necessarily the same. Trade unionists and social activists, ex-FARC combatants are being killed as ever before. But the university, fortunately, although it's changing gradually over here as well, as it is everywhere, I think, it still has managed to keep hold of some academic openness, unlike in perhaps Britain and the United States.
Do you feel like people are more receptive in Colombia to kind of hear you out and your do you feel they're more approachable?
Oh, the student, it's a completely different world in terms of the student population in Colombia. The student, for example, right now there's a cultural week, the university cultural week that the students have fought for in Colombia to have, and it's a week literally there's no classes, there's no formal education in the university, and it's a week where the students engage in cultural activities, political activities. As I say, it's a completely different world entirely in terms of political activism, social activism compared to Britain. Britain. It's like going into a different world. That's all I can say. Going from my university in England and coming here to Colombia, it's a real privilege for me to be in such a cultural, a vibrant atmosphere that I see here. And again, this is despite the propaganda that the education system in Britain is one of the best in the world. It's really not, and it's transformed dramatically. And I think it's because of the gradual erosion that has been taken, the gradual erosion of the students' power, the students' voice, the voice of the professors, the voice of the university professors, the lecturers, the teachers, and it's been taken over by bureaucrats, by management, by administration, lawyers and all the rest of it. And it's great to be in a campus at the moment in Colombia that it isn't about that, it's about student vibrancy and student control. And yeah.
Absolutely. And with your organization, I know there are 3 of you co-founders. Do you have people who also submit things for you to discuss, or is it the 3 of you kind of coming up with, the lessons essentially?
Yeah, so it's a relatively new research center. So we're actually in the business of opening up a membership at the moment. The people who the other 2 people who are co-directors, they're academics, and they've been involved in kind of promoting progressive critical education for a long time. But this is kind of a new endeavor, and it's certainly something that we'll be doing in terms of opening it up. We do have a regular a group of people who like to attend the talks. There's a regular bunch, and it's the plan going forward is to involve a few of them in the center going forward.
And I saw one of the things on the homepage is a Marx event, and I'm like, that's gonna draw people. Okay. So if you could just kind of give like a synopsis, why do you feel and it's kind of a generic question because he's beloved by so many people and movements, but why do you feel he is important to have essentially lessons on?
I think, well, Marx is someone who's often quoted, isn't he? But not so often understood, especially when it comes to his political economic writings. And it's also, there's various lectures out there, not many, but obviously we've got David Harvey who does the talk through Capital in his lectures. But there's obviously different takes, and so it was proposed to us. Would we like to hold a lecture series on Marx's Capital, given by Andy Higginbottom, former academic, who's currently working on a book. He's a political economist working on a book at the moment of Das Kapital. And he has his particular take of the 3 volumes of Das Kapital. But also he knows his stuff. And we thought it would be a great idea to have a lecture series that covers, Marx's Capital, have a reading group that's dedicated to it. So we have about 30 people sign up to the reading group and attending regularly on a weekly basis. So it's really trying to systematically understand capitalism, but also understand it in the 21st century, learn from other people's experience in the reading group. We have a Q&A in the lecture series itself. The lectures are once a month, and although we're about 7 lectures into the lecture series, the previous lectures can be found on our CSSGJ YouTube page. So if anyone would like to have a look at that, be our guest. It would be great to get more people involved, not just in the lecture series, but the CSSGJ.
That's amazing. That's such an amazing concept. I love it so much. I'm definitely going to be signing up for sure. So I was going through some of your articles. I read one of them, and that's why I reached out. So you do write, as I said, a lot about Colombia. And, you make a really great points about the connection between Colombia and the US and Colombia and Venezuela. And I don't think a lot of us Americans really think about that connection, especially when all we're hearing about is Ukraine and Russia 24/7, and there's a million other wars going on. In any case, so in 2019, let me see if I can read my writing. President Maduro was assassinated, and you wrote an article on that. Can you kind of, my viewers probably know a gist of who he was, but can you kind of like go over loosely who he was and why you believe he was assassinated?
So if we're talking about Maduro, you mean the attempted assassination?
Right.
Yeah. The Colombian state played a huge role in the attempted assassination of Maduro in 2019, and the Colombian state, using its territory, using its local military forces, its intelligence, has really been fundamental to U.S. imperialist efforts to bring around regime change in Venezuela. So the mercenaries, the scores of mercenaries that invaded Venezuela, they invaded from Colombian shores, very close to U.S. and Colombian military bases. And I've spent a long time in the rural areas of Colombia, in conflict zones, in guerrilla zones. And I know that you can't spend, the guerrillas can't spend, or armed actors can't spend too long in one particular position because of the sophistication of the US intelligence, the use of drones, the use of satellites. And so these mercenaries that were essentially assigned to try to bring about regime change in Venezuela by, assassinating Nicolas Maduro, they were based in a location training for an extended period of time close to US and Colombian military bases. And they attacked via boat in seas, again, close to a US Navy base that's stationed in Colombia, attacked from the shores of Colombia. The idea that this could be done without the local collaboration of the US state or the Colombian state, it just couldn't possibly happen. But it's not just we've seen many instances. It's not just the assassination attempt against Nicolas Maduro. The intervention from Colombia dates back many years. And we can talk about that if that's something you want to talk about.
Yeah, definitely touch on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so they're known as Rambos, actually. Left-wing guerrillas in Colombia. Perhaps that the border zone often has seen the communist guerrillas exploiting the border zone in order to get away from essentially the Colombian military, because obviously it's a foreign territory. But what the Colombian military do, they're very smart. They send in small squads of mercenary commandos, essentially. So they're not wearing the Colombian military uniform. They're not wearing the Colombian flag, but they're essentially sent by the Colombian state, and they go into Venezuelan territory to assassinate communist guerrillas, leftist guerrillas, but also Venezuelan military figures. We've seen instances where it's not just Colombian guerrillas that have been assassinated in Venezuelan territory. And the Colombian guerrillas have actually come up with the term Rambo to describe these small squads of mercenaries. Just as Rambo, from the movie, Stallone movie, situated in the jungles, kind of harassing, frustrating guerrillas in the night and all the rest of it. These commandos, mercenary commandos that are working for the Colombian state have also been given the title as Rambos, and the guerrillas are constantly looking out for them. And we've seen various assassinations over the past year, especially against a group called La Segunda Marquetalia. Various leaders of them have been assassinated in Venezuelan territory, and the Colombian state has always denied it, blamed it on criminal gangs, said that these were just random criminal gangs, as if it was easy to attack a commander. We're talking about when we're seeing a very senior commander, we're seeing lots of guerrilla camps in the area to protect the area. In order to try to wiggle through these kind of places, you need to rely on some really sophisticated intelligence and some very well-trained commandos. It can't be done by amateurs.
Wow. And I know one of your articles was explaining how, like in America, we have like a war budget, a defense budget, which is a war budget. And in one of your articles, you discuss how in Colombia, big business is essentially who is behind, basically the wars that are going on. Can you kind of touch on that?
Yeah. So Coca-Cola in Colombia is known as Killer Coke because it's Coca-Cola has been involved in various killings of trade unionists in Colombia, and so you'll find in a lot of areas of Colombia where people have been, trade unionists especially, been killed by paramilitaries, right-wing paramilitaries that have had ties to Coca-Cola. People will be boycotting Coke, and you still see signs up today across Colombia saying "Killer Coke," highlighting that this happened. Also, Chiquita, the infamous United Fruit Company that has obviously been very effective in supporting right-wing death squads, not just in Colombia but all throughout Latin America. But they've also been paying right-wing paramilitaries to protect their investments, who have been responsible for many massacres. So we've seen petroleum companies, oil companies have also been, and coal companies have been involved in supporting right-wing death squads in Colombia. So this has played a very important role in terms of drumming up the kind of violent repression against left-wing forces in Colombia, dating back many years, especially as the left became stronger throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. The stronger the left became, the more determined these kind of businesses became to protect their interests. And I think Colombia is always a sign of what can happen, when the left does start to threaten the capital accumulation, the interests of the very wealthy. They will not sit by and stand by. They will often support the most hideous crimes in order to protect their interests and work with local governments and all the rest of it. And Colombia is really a case where you can see class struggle taking so many different forms.
Absolutely. And that's one of the most fascinating yet frustrating things for me as an American. Is one of your articles was discussing how millions of Colombians took to the streets back in April 28th, 2021. And it was, let me see if I can see this correctly, more than 500 cities. I would love our country to care that much, but as an organizer, I'm lucky if we get, I don't know, 100 people. We're very complacent. So can you kind of explain what it's like there as far as the energy, the way that people do band together in solidarity when something needs to be called out and people need to be held accountable?
Yeah, so you're talking about the 28th of April last year, the biggest urban protest. I call it a resistance, really. I was there in Bogota, on the front. They call them the front lines, and these are the people that essentially mowed down with rubber bullets. And I was hit with a rubber bullet, hurt like hell. Calling them the rubber bullet doesn't give justice to the the actual feeling of being hit by a rubber bullet. But people lost their eyes. People were killed. More than 80 people were killed by police. And it was essentially this protest, which again was the most significant, I think probably urban protest in the history, the modern history at least, of Colombia. The people I speak to have never seen anything like it. The Colombian government at the time, the right-wing Colombian government, big friends of the United States, was trying to essentially make blame the coronavirus and make the working class and the peasants pay. And they came out in force, massive force. It was incredible to see the energy and the bravery of so many people. And it was the people coming out of the barrios and coming out of the skipping work because it was so important. But when they came to these protests, they were essentially hit with tear gas. The police here and the military were called in, to quell the protests. It was, they were going on all night. They're going on into the early hours of the morning. People resisting in massive force, and they were being mowed down with trucks, Israeli trucks that had been, the Sandcat vehicle, to literally chase down, many protesters that were just fighting, for their rights and not to be punished by the government at the time and the elite. So it was very significant protests. Lots of people were killed, and tear gas systematically used. The police here always use tear gas. It's their first court of call. I was there was a protest at the university where I was at last week, and the police came using tear gas against the students. But it's inspiring to see so many people. Colombia is funny because it's one of the countries that has suffered the most in terms of the left. Trade unions being mowed down, being killed, being targeted and assassinated, but they still continue to come out in force. It's not like in Britain, as you say, in the United States. It's a war in many areas here, but people, are so determined to fight back, and there's so much we can learn. I always say there's so much we can learn from the Colombians and the labor movement here in Colombia. It's an inspiration. Yeah.
Do you think that some people there feel like they kind of have nothing left to lose?
Absolutely. That's part of it. The bravery of it. There's but it's also the history of resistance, right? It's people have families here. I remember asking asking someone in he was in a conflict area, in an area where there was a war, and he supported the guerrillas, and I said, do you think there'll ever be peace? And he said, there'll never be peace. They've killed our families, they've killed our mothers, they've killed our fathers. How can we forgive or stop fighting against a state that has done this, and that continues to do this? And that's I've seen that many times. There's territories in Colombia, there's areas of Colombia that are in resistance, that are organized in resistance, and despite all the propaganda, they are in resistance. There are lots of people in Colombia that refuse to bow down, and there's a lot of talk of peace at the moment. But a lot of people talking about peace. I've never been to these areas where you've seen lots of people killed with American bullets, bombs, and you might sign a peace agreement, for example, in an area, in a city, an urban city, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll see peace in a local area, and we've got to understand why that is the reality, right?
Yeah, I read one of your articles on that about the 2016 peace agreement that is, basically not exactly withstanding. Are there any ramifications for that? And also, I suppose, what parts of it are being fractured?
So the peace agreement signed in 2016 after more than 50 years of civil war with the former FARC. Obviously, we've got various FARC groups that are communist groups that have basically continued the armed struggle. But this peace agreement was signed in 2016, and the government essentially treated it as a way to demobilize the biggest threat to capital accumulation in Colombia. They used it as a way to demobilize a very powerful, it was at the time the most powerful communist party in opposition in Latin America, right? There's no other communist party that's in opposition that it was more powerful than the FARC in 2016. The idea was to open up political space, to create a situation, for example, a land reform, political reform, and halt forced displacement. Some people call forced displacement in Colombia. They have a very narrow definition of forced displacement, and it's essentially where someone comes onto your home or forces you off it. But a more Marxist definition of forced displacement is a corporation, buying up land, masses of land, so you can't compete and you're forced to leave. As far as I'm concerned, that's the Marxist definition. And if you have that definition of forced displacement, we've seen millions and millions of people forcefully displaced in Colombia. The peace agreement, the government refused to implement the progressive terms of the agreement and just used it as a way to demobilize the FARC as an armed organization. Of course, we've seen the election recently of Gustavo Petro in August, who was inaugurated on August the 7th, the first social democratic president in the history of Colombia, left-leaning president. And there's a lot of hope in terms of him being able to open up political space, for the left, and being able to implement the terms of the peace agreement. I'm a bit, I'm more skeptical than most people on the left. Gustavo Petro. Colombia's got a very undemocratic political system. It's got a very undemocratic political economy and a government. You might have an elected government, but it doesn't mean you're in power, right? It exists in a very undemocratic political economy. So, for example, Petro's having to rely on the support of the Conservative Party in Colombia. He's the Conservative Party in Colombia formed a coalition. So any kind of peace agreement that he wants to negotiate with other groups is kind of dependent on the support of these, historically very right-wing organizations that have always been very anti-socialist, anti-leftist. And it's about power, right? The conservatives, it's not about principle for them, it's about power.
Absolutely. And I digress a bit, but one of the things that I noticed in a lot of your articles is you do allude to and talk about the CIA, and I'm curious how prevalent you think that they are in these movements.
Well, in Colombia, we've WikiLeaks, so obviously I'm working on my PhD on the Colombian Civil War, and WikiLeaks is one of my favorite sources. and it reveals very clearly. I mean, the FARC. There's more than 28,000 classified intelligence cables that WikiLeaks released, and it's a treasure trove of information. But not just the CIA, the U.S. intelligence services in general. This is, it's a well-known thing in terms of the surveillance over here. It's been used heavily in the Civil War. The United States has various military bases. They have at least 7 military bases. I say at least because they're the ones that have been admitted, and we never know how many they actually have. Often they call military bases that are, they pretend they're not military bases. They call them lily pads, but really we would consider them military bases because there's military training there and using it to spy on people. But yeah, WikiLeaks has revealed extensive spying from US intelligence, British intelligence. Obviously I'm from Britain. So Britain has a important role to play in terms of intelligence, especially trying to organize the Colombian police. The Colombian police are attached to the Ministry of Defense over here in Colombia. They're essentially fundamental to the counterinsurgency strategy against the rebels in Colombia. So police often carrying machine guns. They're based in kind of the same thing as military barracks, but they're called police barracks. Yeah.
Wow. As far as WikiLeaks go, I mean, how fucked are we with Assange? Like, like, as a journalist, are you not fucking terrified? Like, it's bad enough right now, okay? But if he does, in fact, get extradited, like, what do you think that means for us?
I mean, it's for me, it's part of it's not an isolated case, unfortunately, right? I mean, it's part of a broader trend. The silencing, social media, for example, has become so intimately tied with the security apparatus in terms of recruiting former FBI agents into these social media companies. I mean, Biden proudly boasted that he was going to make it one of his objectives to bring in the social media companies. They've become so closely tied to Western foreign policy. I don't want to blame everything on the United States here because it's more than that, right? There's networks, imperialist networks that make it complicated. But yeah, it's not good, and it's part of a broader trend. And as I say, I think we see that very, very clearly in the higher education sector in Britain, in terms of it's becoming more difficult to speak out. And there's obviously people trying to engage, universities and all the rest of it, engaging in suppression of people's voices. And yeah, Assange is part of a broader trend of trying to shut down alternative forms of communication, which and it's a very important struggle to fight for Assange, but it's also part of a broader struggle that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you have any current revolutionaries, as in like still alive? Does anyone inspire you that you can look to and still take strength from?
I mean, obviously I focus on Colombia, and there's many brave people in Colombia that have really put themselves under great danger, great risk. They've been part of organizations over many years that have been targeted, and so there's these kind of symbols, but often the kind of alternatives that that present an alternative are role models. It's very difficult to support them, right? Because of all the countermeasures that imperialism uses, in terms of branding people, all kinds of things to try to undermine them. So it's very difficult to be open and to speak open about it. So it's very difficult. But I mean, inspiration is something we see in movements generally, right? I mean, there's inspiration everywhere in terms of people fighting back, people risking their lives, risking their jobs. So it's about looking to the working class movement, peasant movements in Colombia. Of course, Colombia's, as I said, the trade unionists have continued to meet in large groups, could continue to fight back, even though their lives are put at risk. And I think, that's one of the lessons. That's one of the ways we can be inspired by people. We don't have to, put ourselves first, and it's about learning from each other, and having the the courage to stand up, regardless of the risks.
Absolutely. And you do say peasant a lot in your articles, and at first I thought it might have been facetious, and then I just want to clarify, like, is that something that Colombians also call themselves?
So that's a good question. In Colombia, it's campesino. Yeah. So it's a very specific word to Latin America. I suppose the translation, the English translation is peasant, and maybe I should use the word campesino more often. Yeah, peasants in Colombia, it's campesinos. It's not in the European sense, the European feudal sense, where you're purely self-sufficient on land. Nobody in Colombia is purely self-sufficient. But one of the kind of categories, the kind of forms of social class amongst the peasantry in Colombia, you've got people who are partly dependent on land, so partly dependent on producing a certain amount of food. But partly dependent on having to work for a capitalist, having to engage in wage labor. And so this is a kind of, you see the kind of the remnants of the peasantry in the sense that they're part dependent on self-sufficiency, but partly dependent on capitalism. And this allows the capitalists, this allows owners of businesses to pay the peasant less than that they would usually get, because they're partly dependent on their own food. They can be paid less money than that they would ever get if they were completely free of any independent means of production. And so this is kind of this is one of the reasons why the campesino, the peasant, survives in Colombia, because it allows capitalists, allows landowners, perhaps engage in industrial agricultural farming, which is increasingly on the rise in Colombia, allows them to pay them less than that what they would get if they were completely freed from the land entirely. So I think the word campesino is still relevant. People use the word semi-peasant, semi-proletarian, partly dependent on the land and partly dependent on wage labor. So it's, some people don't like that concept because it doesn't capture the kind of complexity people feel. I'm happy to use it. I mean, so yeah. I think there's still a reason to use these kind of social categories today.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Absolutely. I figure at first I was like, I think it's facetious, but maybe not, because there's not quotations. So I wanted to double check. But this is kind of a vague question, but I am curious, as someone in the States, how prevalent do you think our country is, and how much is wrong in Colombia? Like, how much of our fault is it?
Yeah, no, I resist blaming everything on U.S. imperialism, because it's too, for me, it's too crude to say that. I mean, there's relative autonomy in Colombia. There's a Colombian ruling class, that's often in alliance with imperialism. Often embraces imperialism. It certainly embraced imperialism in order to combat the rebels. Imperialism essentially, allowed the Colombian armed forces to upgrade themselves. But there's also class struggle taking place in Colombia, and it's not easy to say, oh, the United States is responsible for X amount. The Colombian dominant class is responsible for X amount. But obviously, it's a relationship, isn't it? And often we'll see, more involvement from dominant class interests in the United States. For example, in the case of Chiquita, but it's very difficult to move away from the kind of US axis, in Colombia. But there's an element of relative autonomy, and I think we've seen this we've seen this in terms of there's business associations, for example, that don't want US competition inside Colombia. There's people fighting against free trade agreements. So that all that plays out, and it highlights the kind of relative autonomy. But nevertheless, if it isn't the US imperialism, it is nevertheless a ruling class, right? There it is a dominant class that has an interest in particular policies, that embraces particular policies. And I think the Colombians realized that. I mean, one of the key drug cartels, for example, played an important role in the murder of trade unionists, and these drug cartels were often very nationalistic. Didn't support opening up relations with the United States. So it's certainly not a question of a crude question of US imperialism having complete control. Britain, as I say, has had an important role to play in Colombia. Israel has had an important role to play. The assault rifle that is used to mow down leftists in Colombia is the Israeli Galil. So it's certainly not just the United States, but they play a very important role in terms of upgrading the military intelligence work, and spying, and they've really helped to improve Colombia's capabilities in that regard for a price, of course. And the price was to open up the economy to US multinational corporations in order to basically help the Colombian ruler class when they faced the existential crisis of the FARC's growth during the 1990s. They presented an existential threat to Colombian capitalism in the 1990s, and the United States essentially came in and took advantage very intelligently of that situation. And of course, we're talking about classes here. We're not talking about United States in general. We're talking about certain interests in the United States.
Absolutely. That you're so freaking brilliant. I can't, my head's like gonna explode. I'm like taking all these mental notes and wanting to like go back and research more, which shows that you are doing a good job in your writing, because sometimes I feel like I know certain things, but you put it out beautifully. A question I always ask my guests that I leave everyone with, and a lot of times it stumps people, so just a warning. What is something that you want the viewers to take away?
Yeah, that is a good question. To learn from that every country is different, that every country has its own history, that its own social formation, its own versions, forms of class struggle, and we shouldn't try to apply our own kind of perspectives that we've gathered in one country, for example, Britain or the United States, and impose them on another country. We should analyze what's going on locally in the local context, and try to avoid these kind of Eurocentric judgments, what we often see from the liberal human rights community, imposing, the imperialist human rights community really imposing their views everywhere, regardless of circumstances. So, understanding the local situation and treating, each country on its own terms. Yeah, and that's a good way to go about analyzing and then making, considering how to implement a particular strategy.
Absolutely. And where can people find you? You and also your organization.
Yep. So we've got a cssgj.org website, so people can sign up to the website online, attend events if they please. They're free, and we've got lots of interesting events. If you're interested in Colombia, we've got a former guerrilla fighter talking on the 7th of November, Tanya Neymeyer, who, funny enough, is wanted in the United States, indicted for being involved allegedly in the imprisonment of free mercenaries that were destroying peasant crops in Colombia, with fumigating peasant crops. So that will be an interesting talk if you're interested in Colombia. Vijay Prashad on the 3rd of October, who's given a talk on the role of the United States in Eurasia. So that'll be related to Ukraine and a whole bunch of other talks. You can find me on Twitter, Oliver C. Dodd. And we've got a YouTube channel as well where we put all our talks up online. I've written for the Morning Star, so if you're interested in reading anything that I've written for the Morning Star, for example, interviews that I've done with guerrilla fighters, or in conflict areas, you can see that on my Morning Star articles. But yeah.
That is so amazing. Thank you so much for joining me, Oliver. You are just awesome. I don't know. You're just awesome. I don't fucking know. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I love you guys, of course, and appreciate you. Update. We are filing with the United Nations, the Human Rights Division of the United Nations. We will be bringing it to them on November 1st. We have been working for over a year with human rights lawyers, and we will be filing an official complaint to the United Nations that for leaving millions of people without health care in our country during a pandemic, no less. So we are taking video testimonials or written. If you're not comfortable on camera, we would like to submit 100 with our complaint. And if you would like to submit one, please go to m4m4all.org. We have Poor People's Campaign on board and a whole bunch of great organizations who have just joined on. So definitely help us with this historic fight, because we're taking it all the way. But thank you guys so much for watching. Next Wednesday, I have Comrade Misty. Monday, Postmortem Breakdown with Andrew and Elias Cepeda. So thanks so much. Oliver, if you want to stay with me one moment. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great night.